$1 for hope. The sun dipped behind the towering buildings of downtown Los Angeles, casting long, golden shadows over the streets. The city was alive with the usual cacophony of honking cars, hurried footsteps, and the occasional siren wailing in the distance. Pedestrians bustled along the sidewalks, their eyes glued to their phones, their minds occupied with thoughts of dinner plans, deadlines, or the weekend ahead. But for Evelyn Carter, time no longer moved in days or weeks, only in moments of survival. The concept of tomorrow was a luxury she no longer afforded herself. She had learned to live in the immediate present, her focus narrowed to the next meal, the next safe place to sleep, and the next dollar that might keep her from starving. She was just another invisible figure in the city's forgotten corners, a woman whose existence had become little more than an afterthought to those who passed her by. Her clothes, once a reflection of a life she barely remembered, were now tattered and layered for warmth. A gray beanie concealed the wild mess of her hair, and her fingers, wrapped in fingerless gloves, clenched the straps of a faded backpack that held all she owned. She had never thought she would end up here, on the streets, begging strangers for money. But life had a cruel way of unraveling even the strongest of people. Tonight, hunger gnawed at her insides, sharper than usual. She had eaten nothing since the previous morning, and the vending machine crackers she had managed to scavenge had done little to quell the emptiness in her stomach. As the night air turned colder, wrapping itself around her like an unwelcome embrace, she pulled her coat tighter and stood outside a brightly lit cafe, watching the customers inside laugh over steaming cups of coffee and plates of untouched pastries. She inhaled deeply, forcing down the lump of shame that rose in her throat. She hated asking for money. Every time, it chipped away at the last remnants of her pride. But the alternative was hunger, and hunger made people do things they never imagined they would. She scanned the faces of those walking past her, looking for someone who might not sneer in disgust or pretend not to hear her. The wealthy businessman ignored her, the couples averted their eyes, and the younger crowd barely noticed her existence. Then she saw him. He stood outside the cafe, waiting for something. Dressed in a casual black jacket and jeans, he had a relaxed posture, hands in his pockets, his dark hair falling just past his shoulders. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was his face, kind, weathered, yet somehow gentle. His presence didn't exude the hurried energy of the others. Instead, he seemed to exist within the moment, unbothered by the rush of the world around him. She hesitated, then forced herself forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice small, barely carrying over the sound of the city. The man turned, his dark eyes settling on her with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. But there was no malice in them, no disdain, just curiosity. "Could you spare $1?" she asked, her fingers tightening around the straps of her backpack. "Just $1. I'm just trying to get something to eat." She braced herself for rejection. She had heard every excuse before. "I don't carry cash. I'd help, but I'm in a rush. Why don't you just get a job?" Instead, the man did something she hadn't expected. He smiled. Not a pitying smile, not the condescending kind she often received from well-meaning strangers. It was warm, genuine, like he actually saw her. "I'll do you one better," he said, reaching into his pocket. "How about I get you a meal instead?" Evelyn blinked, momentarily stunned. Most people either ignored her or threw a couple of coins her way just to ease their own guilt. This was different. She hesitated, her pride warring with her hunger. "You don't have to do that." "I know," the man replied simply. "But I want to." His tone held no judgment, only sincerity. She studied him for a moment, wondering if this was some sort of trick. People weren't kind for no reason, especially not to people like her. But the gnawing hunger inside her won over the hesitation. "Okay," she murmured. "Yeah, that would be nice." The man gestured toward the cafe's entrance. "Come on, then." Evelyn followed him inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapping around her like a soft embrace. The rich aroma of coffee and fresh bread filled the air, making her stomach twist with longing. She could feel the eyes of the customers on her, their gazes filled with silent judgment, but she forced herself to keep walking, keeping her head down. The man led her to the counter and turned to her. "Order whatever you want." She hesitated. The menu was filled with items she hadn't tasted in years. Pastries, soups, sandwiches. She didn't want to take advantage, but she also knew she needed something substantial. "A turkey sandwich," she said finally. "And maybe a coffee." The man nodded. "Make that too," he told the cashier. As the employee rang up the order, Evelyn studied him again, trying to place why he looked so familiar. There was something about his voice, his face, and then it clicked. Her breath caught in her throat. "Wait a minute," she said, her eyes widening. You're Keanu Reeves." The man chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck as if embarrassed. "Guilty." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. She had just asked Keanu Reeves for $1. Of all the people in Los Angeles, she had unknowingly approached one of the most famous actors in the world. For a moment, she was at a loss for words. She had seen his movies, heard the stories of his kindness, but she had never expected to be on the receiving end of it. She started, then shook her head. "I didn't recognize you." "That's a good thing," Keanu said with a grin. "Means I can still blend in." Their order arrived, and he grabbed the tray, leading her to a quiet corner of the cafe. She sat across from him, still trying to process what was happening. As she unwrapped her sandwich, she realized her hands were trembling, not just from hunger, but from the sheer surreal nature of the moment. Keanu took a sip of his coffee, then leaned forward slightly. "So, what's your story?" Evelyn hesitated. She didn't want to burden him with her past. People only asked out of politeness, not because they truly cared. But something in his expression told her otherwise. For the first time in a long while, she felt like someone actually wanted to listen. She swallowed her pride, took a deep breath, and began to speak. And with that, her life would never be the same again. The weight of the past. Evelyn Carter had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. When you lived on the streets, it wasn't just a means of survival, it was a necessity. If people didn't see you, they couldn't hurt you. If they ignored you, they couldn't judge you. And if you were lucky, you could fade into the background, just another ghost wandering the sidewalks of a city that had long since stopped caring. But here she was, sitting across from Keanu Reeves, a man the entire world recognized. Yet somehow he saw her, really saw her. The sandwich in her hands felt heavier than it should have, not just because of hunger, but because of the weight of the moment. She had long forgotten what it was like to eat a meal that wasn't scavenged or handed to her with pity. And now this man, one of the biggest actors on the planet, was watching her with quiet patience, waiting for her to speak, as if her story actually mattered. She wasn't sure where to start. The past wasn't a simple thing. It wasn't just a series of bad choices or unfortunate circumstances. It was layers upon layers of pain, regret, and lost time. She took a shaky breath. "You really want to know?" Keanu nodded, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his expression calm but expectant. "Only if you want to tell me." She stared at the table for a long moment, then finally exhaled. "All right." She traced her finger along the edge of the table, a nervous habit from long ago, and let the memories come. "I wasn't always like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a life. A good one. I had dreams. I was gonna be an artist." Keanu's eyes flickered with interest, but he didn't interrupt. "I was pretty good too," she continued. "Got into art school, studied under some great teachers. I painted all the time. Portraits, landscapes, abstract stuff. It was the only thing that ever made sense to me." She stopped for a moment, the memory of her younger self flashing in her mind, the girl with paint-stained fingers, eyes bright with ambition, a heart full of hope. That girl felt like a stranger now. But then life happened, she said bitterly. I got pregnant when I was 21. It wasn't planned, but I loved her. My daughter, Mia. She was everything. The name felt foreign on her tongue, like something she wasn't allowed to say anymore. She had these big brown eyes, always so curious about everything. She loved colors. She used to sit next to me while I painted, asking me a million questions about the shapes and shades I used. A small broken laugh escaped her. She said she wanted to be an artist like me. Keanu didn't speak, but his expression softened, as if he understood exactly what she was about to say next. Evelyn's smile faded. She got sick when she was 5. Leukemia. We fought like hell to save her, but her voice cracked, and she clenched her fists. I lost her. The cafe noise faded into the background. The weight of those words settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Keanu inhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving her. I'm so sorry. She nodded stiffly, her throat burning. I tried to keep it together after that. I really did, but I couldn't. I stopped painting, stopped caring. She swallowed hard. I started drinking. First just to take the edge off, then because I couldn't function without it. Keanu leaned back slightly, processing her words, his fingers tapping lightly against his cup. I lost my job, then my apartment. My friends got tired of trying to save me. I burned every bridge I had left. And before I knew it, she gestured vaguely at herself. This was my life. Silence settled between them. Evelyn braced herself for the usual responses, the awkward apologies, the empty reassurances, the well-meaning but useless advice about getting back on her feet. But Keanu didn't offer any of those things. Instead, he said, I get it. She blinked. You get it. He nodded, his expression distant, as if he were remembering something painful of his own. I lost my daughter too, he said quietly. Evelyn froze. Keanu stared down at his coffee, his voice softer now. Her name was Ava. She was stillborn. Evelyn felt her breath hitch. My fiancée, Jennifer, died not long after. He exhaled slowly. Losing them, it changed everything. For a long time, I didn't know how to exist in a world where they weren't. His words hit her like a punch to the chest. She had known about his tragedies. Everyone did. But hearing him speak about them so openly, so rawly, made it feel real in a way that news headlines never could. She searched his face, looking for some trace of insincerity, but there was none. This was a man who knew grief, who had sat in the same darkness she had, who had wrestled with the same demons. You kept going, she said after a long pause. How? Keanu was quiet for a moment. Then he shrugged. I don't know if I did. I just moved forward, one step at a time. I think that's all we can do. Evelyn absorbed his words, rolling them over in her mind. One step at a time. Could it really be that simple? She looked down at her half-eaten sandwich, her appetite suddenly gone. I don't even know if I want to keep going. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Then why are you still here? She flinched, his question cutting deeper than she expected. Because, he continued, if you really didn't want to, you wouldn't have asked for $1. You wouldn't have let me buy you this meal. Something inside you does want to keep going. Maybe it's small. Maybe it's buried under all the pain. But it's still there. Evelyn didn't know how to respond to that. She had spent so many years believing she was beyond saving, that she had nothing left to live for. But here, in this moment, across from a man who understood loss in a way most people never could, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A dangerous, fragile thing. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table to her. What's this? She asked warily. A name. And an address. She hesitated before unfolding the paper. The name was unfamiliar. The address was somewhere in the city. It's a place that helps people get back on their feet, Keanu said. They have resources, shelter, therapy, job training, and art programs. Her chest tightened. Why are you doing this? Keanu studied her for a moment before saying, because someone once helped me when I thought I didn't deserve it. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she clutched the paper. She didn't know if she could do this. She didn't know if she deserved to. But maybe, just maybe, she owed it to herself to try. And for the first time in years, she considered the possibility that tomorrow might be worth facing after all. The first step forward. The slip of paper in Evelyn's hand felt heavier than it should have, as if the address scribbled across it carried more weight than mere ink on paper. It was an opportunity, one she hadn't asked for, one she wasn't even sure she wanted. Yet, as she sat in the warmth of the cafe, across from a man who had nothing to gain from helping her, she couldn't bring herself to fold it up and toss it away. Keanu watched her, his expression unreadable but patient, as if he knew she was at war with herself. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was beyond saving, that life had closed its doors on her, that even the thought of change felt foreign, dangerous, even. She traced a finger over the address. "And what if I don't belong there?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Keanu leaned back, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. "What makes you think you don't?" Evelyn exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Because people like me don't get second chances." A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of Keanu's lips. "Says who?" She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. "Says who?" The question hung in the air between them. Was it the world that had given up on her? Or had she been the one who decided she was beyond redemption? The longer she thought about it, the more she realized she had no answer. Keanu took a slow sip of his coffee before speaking again. "Look, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I can't make this decision for you. But I can tell you this. Life doesn't hand out second chances, Evelyn. You have to take them." The way he said her name sent a strange warmth through her. It had been so long since someone had said it without pity or contempt. Evelyn swallowed. She didn't know what scared her more. The thought of staying on the streets forever, or the idea of stepping into something new, something unknown. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her worn-out coat. She wasn't making any promises, not to Keanu, not to herself. But she would keep the address. For now. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu simply nodded. "You don't have to thank me." She wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she finished the last of her sandwich, her stomach grateful for the warmth of real food. When they finally stood to leave, Keanu handed her something else, an extra cup of coffee, fresh and hot. "For later," he said with a wink. Evelyn took it, surprised at how much the simple gesture meant. "You really are like they say," she murmured. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "And what do they say?" She gave a small, almost shy smile. "That you're one of the good ones." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know about that, but I do believe in people." Evelyn clutched the cup a little tighter. Maybe that was enough. As they stepped out of the cafe, the city greeted them with its usual chaos. Horns honking, lights flashing, pedestrians weaving through the sidewalks. The moment of stillness between them felt like it shouldn't belong here, yet it did. She turned to him, suddenly uncertain of how to say goodbye. "Are you just gonna walk off into the night now?" Keanu smirked. "That's usually how it goes in the movies, isn't it?" She laughed, a real laugh, not the bitter kind she was used to. It felt strange but good. "I guess so." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking again. "If you ever need anything, find me." Evelyn looked up at him, surprised. "Why?" His gaze softened. "Because no one should have to do it alone." She had no words for that. As Keanu turned and disappeared into the night, Evelyn stood there for a long time, the coffee in her hands growing cooler by the second. She pulled the slip of paper out of her pocket again, staring at the address. And for the first time in years, she took a step towards something different. The building was tucked away in a quieter part of the city, far from the bright lights and crowded streets. From the outside, it didn't look like much, just another structure made of brick and glass. But as Evelyn stood before the door, reading the words on the sign, "The Haven. A new start begins here," she felt her stomach twist. She almost turned around. Almost. But then she thought of Keanu's words. No one should have to do it alone. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, warm. The air smelled of coffee and fresh paper, and the sound of quiet conversations filled the space. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" Evelyn hesitated before speaking. I don't know if I'm in the right place." The woman's smile didn't falter. "If you're looking for help, you're exactly where you need to be." Evelyn clenched her hands into fists at her sides. She wanted to run, but she stayed. The woman gestured toward a row of chairs. "Why don't you have a seat? We can talk whenever you're ready." She nodded stiffly and sat, her fingers tapping nervously against her knee. The walls were lined with paintings, sketches, art that carried emotion, stories. Some were dark, full of sorrow. Others held a fragile kind of hope. Her gaze lingered on one in particular, a painting of a lone figure standing at the edge of a vast, empty road, the horizon glowing with the first hints of sunrise. Something about it spoke to her. She wasn't sure what her future held. She wasn't sure if she could ever be the person she used to be. But as she sat there, staring at the painting, she realized something. Maybe she didn't have to be the person she used to be. Maybe she could be someone new. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to try. Healing and redemption. Evelyn sat in the waiting area of the Haven, her body rigid, her hands restless in her lap. She had spent the last several years bracing for impact, for rejection, for the world to remind her she didn't belong. But this place felt different. The walls weren't sterile like the shelters she had drifted through. Instead, they were covered in paintings, sketches, murals that carried the weight of untold stories. Some were chaotic and full of pain, while others felt like a quiet promise of something better. The emotions in them were raw, real, and for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt like she wasn't just passing through another cold, indifferent space. She was meant to be here. A woman in her 50s approached with a warm, practiced smile. Her name tag read Linda, and her short, graying curls framed a face that carried kindness in its lines. "You must be Evelyn," she said, settling into the chair beside her. "Keanu told me you might be stopping by." Evelyn's eyes widened. He had called ahead. She cleared her throat, suddenly uneasy. I didn't say I was staying." Linda nodded as if she'd heard this 1,000 times before. "That's okay. No one ever does at first." Evelyn fidgeted, glancing at the door. "I don't know if this is for me." Linda leaned back, crossing her legs. "That's fair, but let's put it this way. If you leave, what's waiting for you out there?" Evelyn swallowed hard. The cold, the hunger, the night spent staring at the sky, wondering if she'd wake up the next morning. "Here," Linda continued, her voice gentle but firm, "you have a roof, a warm bed, food, and, when you're ready, people who can help. No strings attached." Evelyn hesitated. She had learned that kindness often came with a hidden price, but Keanu had asked for nothing, and Linda's words didn't carry the weight of expectation. She exhaled, pressing her palms against her knees. I don't have anything left," she admitted. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Linda smiled. "Then this is a good place to start." For the first time in years, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that was true. The transition wasn't easy. Even though the Haven was nothing like the overcrowded shelters she had known, Evelyn still felt like an outsider among the other residents. Some had been there for months, others only days, each carrying their own burdens. Addiction, loss, trauma. Everyone here had something they were trying to escape. At night, she lay awake on the unfamiliar mattress, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the quiet. The streets had been noisy, but she had grown accustomed to that. The hum of the city, the occasional shouts, the sound of her own loneliness pressing in on her. But here, in this safe space, the silence forced her to listen to the voice in her head, the one she had drowned out with alcohol, distractions, and self-loathing. You don't belong here. You'll never be whole again. You're still the same broken woman who lost everything. The voice never stopped. But then there was Art. It started small. A staff member named Tom, who ran the creative therapy sessions, casually mentioned that they had an art room available to residents. Evelyn had brushed it off at first, claiming she wasn't interested. But one evening, when the weight of the silence became too much, she found herself standing in the doorway of the studio, staring at the paint-splattered tables and blank canvases. Tom looked up from where he was sorting supplies. "Didn't think I'd see you in here." Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. "I was just looking." Tom gestured toward the nearest table. "Well, if you feel like doing more than looking, there's plenty to work with." Evelyn hesitated, then slowly stepped inside. The scent of acrylic paint and charcoal was painfully familiar, tugging at something deep inside her. She ran her fingers along the wooden edge of a canvas, her mind flashing back to the past, to late nights spent painting in her tiny apartment, to Mia sitting beside her, watching with wide, fascinated eyes. Her throat tightened. "I can't do this." But then, before she could stop herself, she picked up a paintbrush. She started slow, just testing strokes on the canvas, feeling out the texture. The motion was stiff at first, unfamiliar after years of neglect. But then something shifted. Her hands moved without thinking, guided by muscle memory rather than conscious effort. The paint swirled, blended, took on form and depth. She didn't know what she was making. Not yet, but something inside her was waking up. She painted until her wrist ached, until the floodgates in her mind cracked open, spilling color onto the canvas in a way she hadn't allowed herself in years. And when she finally stepped back, she saw Mia's face staring back at her. She staggered, breath catching in her throat. She hadn't planned to paint her daughter, but there she was, her wide, curious eyes, her gentle smile, captured in a way that felt both devastating and beautiful. Tears blurred Evelyn's vision. She had spent years running from her grief, but in this moment, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want to forget Mia. She wanted to remember her. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to keep living. Days turned into weeks. Evelyn kept returning to the art room. Some days, the brush felt too heavy to lift, the memories too sharp, but she pushed through it. Each painting was a step forward, a conversation with herself, a battle against the past, a reclaiming of something she had lost. One afternoon, as she was finishing a piece, a familiar voice startled her. "That's beautiful." She turned, her heart skipping a beat. Keanu stood in the doorway, dressed in his usual black jacket and jeans, his gaze fixed on the canvas in front of her. For a moment, she just stared. She had almost convinced herself that their meeting had been a dream, that he had been a passing stranger who had helped her and then disappeared like some kind of guardian angel. But he was here, real. She exhaled a shaky laugh. "You actually came back." Keanu smirked. "Told you to find me if you needed anything." She shook her head, gesturing to the room around her. "I think I found something better." His eyes softened. "Yeah, I think you did." Evelyn glanced at the painting, at Mia's face staring back at her, at the life she had unknowingly poured onto the canvas. Keanu studied it for a long moment before nodding. "She'd be proud of you." A lump formed in Evelyn's throat. She wasn't sure if that was true, but for the first time, she wanted to believe it. They stood there in silence for a while, the hum of the world outside feeling distant, unimportant. Finally, Keanu broke the quiet. "So, what's next?" Evelyn hesitated. She still didn't have all the answers. She wasn't magically healed, wasn't suddenly free of her pain. But she was trying. She looked at her painting, then back at him. "I think," she said slowly, I want to see what happens if I don't give up. Keanu smiled. That's a good place to start. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt like she had a future worth reaching for. The roadblocks. Evelyn had spent so many years at rock bottom that she never imagined what climbing back up might feel like. The initial days at the Haven had been surreal. Learning how to exist in a space where she didn't have to constantly fight to survive. She woke up in a bed instead of on the pavement. She had meals that didn't come from a dumpster. She had conversations that weren't reduced to a single desperate plea for help. But just because things were changing didn't mean they were easy. The past still clung to her like a second skin, whispering in her ear at night, taunting her with every mistake she had ever made. You don't belong here. You're going to screw this up. You always do. But Evelyn gritted her teeth and pushed forward. She poured herself into the art therapy sessions, throwing everything onto the canvas. Her grief, her anger, her guilt. Some days it helped. Other days, it left her raw, open, vulnerable in a way she didn't know how to handle. Keanu visited every so often, just as he had promised. He never made a big deal about it, never acted like he was checking in out of obligation. He just showed up, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but conversation, and sat with her as if they had known each other for years. One afternoon, he walked into the art room just as she was finishing another painting, this one abstract, swirling with reds and blacks, chaos bleeding onto the canvas. Keanu tilted his head as he studied it. Looks intense. Evelyn wiped her hands on a rag, exhaling. It feels intense. He glanced at her. Rough day. She shrugged. Just hard. The past doesn't go away just because I want it to. Keanu nodded slowly. No, it doesn't. He didn't offer empty platitudes, and she appreciated that. He hesitated for a moment before asking, have you thought about showing your work? Evelyn's stomach twisted. Showing it. At a gallery, he said simply. People should see this. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Right. Because people are dying to see art from a homeless nobody who can barely keep her life together. Keanu frowned. You're not a nobody, Evelyn. She bit her lip, looking away. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Maybe not, he admitted. But when you are, I know someone who could help. Evelyn's fingers twitched. Once upon a time, she had dreamed of this, of her art hanging in galleries, of people admiring her work, of being seen. But that was a different life, a different version of her. She wasn't sure she deserved that dream anymore. Still, she pocketed his words, just as she had pocketed that slip of paper weeks ago. She wasn't ready, but maybe someday. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new for herself. And then the past came knocking. It happened when she least expected it. She was walking back from a therapy session when she heard her name, her old name, the one she hadn't heard spoken by a familiar voice in years. Eve? She froze. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing just a few feet away, was Ryan, her ex, her biggest mistake, her nightmare. His hair was shorter than she remembered, his face more worn, but his eyes were the same, dark, calculating, sharp in a way that made her chest tighten. She took an involuntary step back. What are you doing here? Ryan smirked, shoving his hands in his pockets. I could ask you the same thing. Last I heard, you were wasting away on the streets. Evelyn's stomach churned. I don't do that anymore. He tilted his head. So I've heard. You got a nice little setup now, huh? A place to sleep, some fancy art therapy. He let out a cold chuckle. Didn't think you had it in you. She hated the way his words slithered under her skin, making her feel small again. What do you want, Ryan? He shrugged, stepping closer. Come on, Eve. Don't be like that. I don't go by that name anymore. Ryan raised an eyebrow. Oh, so it's Evelyn now. Reinventing yourself, huh? That's cute. Her fists clenched. I'm not the same person I was back then. He gave her a slow, knowing smile. Sure you are. You're just playing pretend. The words struck something deep inside her, something ugly and fragile. Ryan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You can clean yourself up all you want, but we both know who you really are. You're just one bad day away from crashing right back down. Evelyn's heart pounded. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong. But the terrifying part, somewhere deep down, she believed him. That night, she sat in the dark of her room at the Haven, her arms wrapped around herself, the past pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. She had worked so hard to get here, but was it real? Or was she just delaying the inevitable? Her mind whispered old temptations, old vices, old escapes. Just one drink, just one night of forgetting, just one moment of numbing the pain. She almost gave in. Almost. But then, her fingers brushed against a canvas propped against the wall, the one of Mia. Her breath hitched. What would Mia say if she saw you now? Tears burned in her eyes. She clenched her fists, breathing through the storm in her mind. She had come too far to go back now. She wasn't Evelyn Carter, the homeless woman who had given up. She wasn't Eve, the girl who had made bad choices, who had let the wrong people in. She was becoming someone new. And no one, not even Ryan, was going to take that from her. The next morning, Evelyn walked into the art room and picked up a brush with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. She painted the face of a woman she didn't quite recognize yet. Someone strong, someone who had survived, someone who deserved to exist. And when Keanu visited later that day, she looked him in the eye and said the words she had never believed she'd say. I think I want to show my work. Keanu's smile was slow and proud. I think the world needs to see it. For the first time, she almost believed that was true. A life transformed. Evelyn had spent most of her life believing that some people weren't meant to win. That second chances were for the lucky few. That people like her, people who had fallen too far, who had broken themselves beyond repair, weren't supposed to find a way back. And yet here she was, standing in the center of an art gallery, surrounded by people admiring her work. She could barely breathe. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. After she had told Keanu she was ready to show her work, things had moved faster than she had expected. He had introduced her to an old friend of his, Julia Moreno, a well-known gallery owner with a sharp eye and an even sharper instinct for recognizing raw talent. Evelyn had been terrified when Julia first looked through her paintings. She had prepared herself for rejection, for criticism, for the inevitable confirmation that she wasn't good enough. Instead, Julia had simply nodded and said, "These are powerful. People need to see them." And just like that, Evelyn's world shifted. She had spent years fading into the background, hiding from herself, from others, from the pain of her past. But now her work was on display, and for the first time in forever, people were looking at her, not as a beggar, not as a lost cause, but as an artist. The gallery was packed. Strangers wandered from one piece to the next, murmuring in hushed voices about the emotions her paintings evoked. The rawness, the depth. Some of them pointed to the portrait of Mia, the one that had started it all, the painting that had cracked her heart open and forced her to remember that her daughter had existed, that she had mattered. A woman in her 50s stood in front of it, dabbing at her eyes. "It feels like she's still here," she whispered. Evelyn's throat tightened. She had never painted to impress anyone. She had painted to survive. And yet, somehow, her survival was reaching people. A quiet presence settled beside her. "You okay?" She turned to find Keanu standing there, hands in his pockets, watching her with that patient, steady gaze. She exhaled slowly. "I don't know. I feel like I'm going to pass out." He chuckled. "That's how you know it's real." She glanced around. "I can't believe this is happening." Keanu smiled. "I can." Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved this. As the night continued, people approached her, offering words of encouragement, asking about her process, her inspiration. Some asked about the darkness in her work, the sorrow woven into each brushstroke. She didn't shy away from the truth. She told them about Mia, about grief, about survival. And instead of pity, she saw something else in their eyes. Understanding, connection, hope. By the end of the evening, Julia approached her with a glint in her eye. "I've had 3 people ask about purchasing your work." Evelyn almost dropped the glass of water she was holding. "Wait, what?" Julia smirked. "Your art is good, Evelyn, and people see its value. I already have an offer on the Mia portrait." Evelyn's stomach twisted. She had painted that piece in a moment of raw, unfiltered pain. She wasn't sure if she could let it go. I don't know," she admitted. Julia nodded, as if she understood. "Think about it. No pressure." Evelyn swallowed hard. She had spent so long believing she had nothing left to offer the world, and now people were willing to pay for something she had created. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. Keanu nudged her gently. "You okay?" She turned to him, her emotions swirling in a way she couldn't quite control. "I think my brain just exploded." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "That's a good problem to have." Evelyn exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. She still wasn't sure if she could believe all of this was real, but she wanted to. And that was new. Later that night, after the crowd had thinned and the gallery had emptied, Evelyn lingered in front of the Mia portrait. She had always been afraid of moving on, afraid that healing meant forgetting. But looking at her daughter's face on the canvas, she realized something. She hadn't lost Mia. Mia had never left her. She was in every brushstroke, every memory, every moment Evelyn chose to keep going. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "You be proud of me, baby," she whispered. And for the first time, she really believed it. The next morning, Evelyn woke up to an email from Julia. The Mia painting had been sold. Her heart clenched, but before she could let the panic settle in, she saw the buyer's name. Her breath caught in her throat. Keanu Reeves. She stared at the screen, barely processing what she was seeing. She grabbed her phone and called him, her voice still groggy from sleep. "You bought it." His voice was casual, but there was something deeper beneath it. "Yeah." "Why?" A pause. Then, "Because some things belong with the people who love them most." Evelyn's breath hitched. She wiped her eyes, a small, shaky laugh escaping her. "You really are something else, Keanu." His smile was audible in his response. "So are you, Evelyn." And for the first time in her life, she started to believe it. Full circle, giving back. Evelyn Carter had spent years believing she was nothing more than a forgotten shadow, a name lost in the cracks of a city that never stopped moving. But standing in her own studio, surrounded by her own paintings, with a future she never thought she'd have, she realized something that sent a warmth through her chest. She had survived. And not just survived, she had rebuilt. It had been 6 months since her first gallery showing. 6 months since Keanu had bought the Mia portrait, since she had dared to believe in the possibility of something more. The days that followed had been surreal. She had received more offers to showcase her work, opportunities that once felt impossible. But more importantly, she had found her purpose. It had started with a simple thought. What if there were others like me? Others who just needed someone to believe in them the way Keanu believed in me. So she had taken her earnings from the gallery show and done something unthinkable. She had opened the Studio of Hope, a small but vibrant space where people who had lost their way could find themselves again through art. The place wasn't fancy, not like the pristine galleries in the city. But that wasn't the point. The walls were lined with blank canvases waiting to be filled, the shelves stocked with donated paints and brushes. The first time a woman walked through the door, a girl named Leah, barely 20, fresh off the streets, and shaking with the weight of addiction. Evelyn had seen herself in her eyes, and she had given her a brush. Leah had stared at it like it was a foreign object. What am I supposed to do with this? Evelyn had simply smiled. Whatever you want. The first stroke had been hesitant, uncertain. But then another came. And another. And by the end of the session, Leah had a tear-streaked face and a canvas full of colors that spoke more than words ever could. That was the moment Evelyn knew. This was what she was meant to do. And now, months later, the studio was full of people just like Leah, just like her, people who needed to create, to heal, to be reminded that they were more than their worst days. One evening, as she was cleaning up after a session, the door opened and a familiar presence filled the space. Evelyn didn't even have to look up. "You know, you don't always have to make a dramatic entrance," she said with a smirk. Keanu chuckled, stepping inside. "But then how would you know I'm here?" She turned to him, a paintbrush still in her hand. "You always find me anyway." His gaze swept across the room, taking in the people still painting, the quiet hum of music in the background, the warmth that filled the space. "This place is incredible, Evelyn." Her chest tightened. "It's more than I ever thought I'd have." Keanu nodded. "Because you made it happen." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I wouldn't be here if you hadn't." He cut her off with a knowing look. "You did this. I just gave you a push." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over her. He was right. He had helped her, but every step forward had been her choice. She had saved herself. Evelyn gestured to one of the paintings on the wall, one of her newer pieces. A lone figure standing on the edge of a vast, endless road, the sky above it bursting with light. Keanu studied it for a long moment. "What's it called?" She smiled softly. "The road ahead." A slow, proud grin spread across his face. "Fitting." She nodded, a warmth filling her chest. "Yeah, it is." Later that night, as she was locking up, she noticed someone standing outside the studio. A woman, wrapped in a tattered coat, eyes darting nervously, her hands fidgeting. Evelyn knew the look. It was the look of someone who was debating whether or not to ask for help. The same look she had worn that night outside the cafe when she had asked for a single dollar. She stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Hey." The woman flinched slightly, then looked up. "I don't mean to bother you. I just..." Evelyn already knew what she was going to say. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a single crumpled dollar. The woman blinked, startled. Evelyn smiled. "I know what it's like to ask for one of these." The woman hesitated before taking it, her fingers trembling. "Thank you." Evelyn studied her for a moment, then did something else. She pulled out a slip of paper and handed it over. The woman frowned. "What's this?" Evelyn's smile grew. "An address." The woman's eyes flickered with confusion. Evelyn tilted her head toward the studio behind her. "It's a place where you can start over, if you want to." The woman stared at her, searching her face for signs of judgment or pity. She found neither. After a long pause, she whispered, "Do you think someone like me could really start over?" Evelyn didn't even hesitate. Yes. And for the first time, she realized, this was what full circle looked like. A year ago, she had been the one asking for help. Now, she was the one giving it, and that was more valuable than any dollar in the world. As the woman clutched the address in her hands, Evelyn stepped back, giving her space to decide. She didn't know if the woman would take the chance, but she hoped she would. Because sometimes, all it took was a single act of kindness to change everything, just like it had changed her. As she walked away, the city lights glowing around her, Evelyn whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. To Keanu. To Mia. To herself. She had once believed she was beyond saving. But now, she knew the truth. She had never been lost. She had just been waiting to be found. And now she was ready to help others find their way too. Because hope wasn't meant to be kept. It was meant to be shared. And Evelyn Carter had a lifetime of hope to give.